That Tuesday morning, Margaret woke up at 7 a.m. sharp, made her usual cup of Earl Grey tea, and lived through an entirely ordinary day until she went to bed that night and woke up the next morning to find her phone showing the exact same date, Tuesday, March 7th, the same morning, the same day she had already lived. Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're exploring one of reality's most unsettling glitches, those rare moments when time itself seems to roll backward, when days repeat, when the universe hits an invisible rewind button that only a handful of people seem to notice. I'm sharing real stories from people who've experienced this phenomenon, and we'll dive into what neuroscience and psychology tell us about these temporal disruptions. Please subscribe, hit that like button, and share your own experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they help us understand this mysterious aspect of human consciousness. Let's begin. Margaret Henderson was 53 years old, a high school literature teacher in Portland, Oregon, living a life of comfortable routine that she'd carefully built over decades. Every weekday morning began the same way. Alarm at 6:45, shower with lavender soap that filled the bathroom with its calming scent, then downstairs to the kitchen where sunlight streamed through the east-facing window, warming the terracotta tiles beneath her bare feet. She'd fill the kettle, listening to its growing whistle as the water heated, pour it over an Earl Grey tea bag in her favorite blue ceramic mug, the one her daughter had given her for Mother's Day 3 years ago, and sit at the small breakfast table with her laptop, checking emails from students and reviewing the day's lesson plans. Her life had this quality of pleasant predictability. She lived alone after her divorce 7 years earlier, and she'd come to appreciate the silence of her mornings, the way she could hear the house settling around her, the distant sound of her neighbor's car starting in the driveway, the soft patting of her cat Hemingway's Dawes as he descended the stairs, expecting his breakfast. There was comfort in knowing what each day would bring: her third-period class discussing The Great Gatsby, lunch in the teacher's lounge with her colleague Patricia, afternoon grading session at her desk while students worked independently, then home by 4:30 to prepare a simple dinner and settle in with a book. March 7th, 2024 began exactly this way. Margaret woke to her alarm, the room still dim with pre-dawn gray light filtering through her curtains. The air held that particular coolness of early spring mornings, when winter hasn't quite released its grip, but you can sense warmth waiting just around the corner. She showered, feeling the hot water cascade over her shoulders, washing away the last remnants of sleep. She made her tea, the bergamot scent mixing with the smell of toast she'd put in the toaster. Hemingway wound between her ankles, purring his morning demands. Everything felt exactly as it should. At school, her day unfolded with its usual rhythm. Third-period discussion about Gatsby's green light went well. One student, Jenny Morrison, made an insightful comment about symbolism that Margaret wrote down to remember. Lunch with Patricia involved conversation about an upcoming faculty meeting and Patricia's grandson's birthday party that weekend. The afternoon passed with paper grading, red pen scratching across essays about Fitzgerald's use of imagery. She felt that familiar end-of-day tiredness settling into her shoulders as she packed her bag at 4:15, said goodbye to the janitor mopping the hallway, and drove home through light traffic.
Dinner was salmon with roasted vegetables. She ate at her kitchen table, reading a few chapters of a mystery novel she'd started the week before. The evening news played in the background, something about local politics, a weather forecast promising rain tomorrow. At 9:30, she brushed her teeth, the mint taste of toothpaste sharp and clean in her mouth, changed into her cotton nightgown, and climbed into bed. Hemingway curled at the foot of the bed, his warmth against her feet. She set her alarm for 6:45, as always, and turned off the bedside lamp. Sleep came easily, as it usually did. Margaret's eyes opened to the sound of her alarm. The room held that same dim, gray quality of early morning light. She reached over, silenced the phone, and glanced at the screen. 6:45, Tuesday, March 7th. She stared at the date for a moment, her still sleepy brain not immediately processing what she was seeing. Tuesday, March 7th. But that was yesterday, wasn't it? She sat up in bed, fully awake now, her heart beginning to beat faster with a strange, sourceless anxiety. She checked the date again, refreshed the screen. Tuesday, March 7th, 2024. Her first thought was that her phone had glitched. Technology fails all the time. She dealt with frozen computers, corrupted files, devices that displayed wrong information. She got out of bed, her feet touching the cool floor, and walked to her desk where her laptop sat. She opened it, waited for the screen to brighten. The date in the corner, Tuesday, March 7th, 2024. A cold feeling began creeping up her spine.
She checked her wall calendar hanging by her dresser. March 7th fell on a Tuesday this year. But she had already lived this day. She remembered it. Jenny Morrison's comment, Patricia's grandson, salmon for dinner. Margaret stood in her bedroom, in her cotton nightgown, feeling the morning coolness on her skin, and tried to make sense of what was happening. Had she dreamed yesterday? Had she experienced some kind of elaborate, detailed dream that felt like an entire day? But dreams weren't like this. They were fragmented, illogical, shifting. I remembered yesterday with perfect clarity. The taste of her tea, the feel of the red pen in my hand, the exact words Jenny had used about symbolism, the plot points of her mystery novel. This wasn't a dream. This was memory. She went through her morning routine on autopilot, her mind racing. Shower, the same lavender soap, the same hot water. Downstairs, kettle whistle, Earl Grey tea in the blue mug. Dosed, Hemingway appearing, purring, expecting food. And as she did these things, a deeply unsettling realization began taking shape. Everything was happening exactly as it had yesterday. The sunlight hit the terracotta tiles at the same angle. Hemingway rubbed against her left ankle first, then her right. The toast popped up at the exact moment she poured the water for her tea. The morning felt like a recording being played a second time, every note hitting the same pitch. At school, the unsettling feeling intensified into something close to horror. She walked down the hallway and saw her colleague Robert wearing the exact same blue sweater he'd worn yesterday. Or, had it been yesterday? She stopped by Patricia's classroom before first period, and Patricia said, "Morning, did you finish that mystery novel?" Margaret had finished 3 chapters last night. She'd told Patricia about it at lunch yesterday. Hadn't she? Patricia was looking at her expectantly, waiting for an answer. Not yet, Margaret managed to say, her voice sounding strange to her own ears.
Third period arrived. Her students filed in. Jenny Morrison sat in her usual seat by the window. Margaret began the discussion on Chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby, asking the question she'd asked yesterday about symbolism. And Jenny, dear God, Jenny, raised her hand and said the exact same insightful comment Margaret had written down yesterday, word for word. The same pause before green light, the same hand gesture. Margaret stood frozen at the front of the classroom, chalk in her hand, staring at Jenny, feeling reality tilt sideways. She had heard these exact words 24 hours ago. She had praised Jenny for this exact insight. She had written it down in her notebook. But when she checked her notebook during lunch, sitting across from Patricia in the teacher's lounge, listening to Patricia tell her about her grandson's upcoming birthday party, a conversation Margaret had already had yesterday, there was no note about Jenny's comment. The page for March 7th was blank, waiting to be filled. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she held her sandwich, barely able to eat. Patricia didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. No one noticed. The day was unfolding exactly as it had before, and Margaret was the only one who remembered living it already. The rest of the day passed in a fog of déjà vu so intense it felt suffocating. Every conversation happened exactly as before. Every small event, the student who dropped his pencil in 5th period, the announcement over the PA system about a schedule change, the janitor she passed in the hallway at 4:15, all of it repeated with precision. Margaret drove home in a state of numb shock, her mind unable to process what was happening. Was she going insane? Had she had a stroke? Was this some kind of neurological breakdown that made her believe she was reliving time? That night, she couldn't bring herself to eat salmon. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the wall, her tea growing cold in the blue mug. Hemingway sensed her distress and stayed close, pressing against her leg. At 9:30, Margaret went through her bedtime routine with a feeling of deep dread. What if she woke up tomorrow and it was March 7th again? What if she was trapped in this day, living it over and over? The thought made her chest tight with panic. She lay in bed, unable to sleep for hours, listening to every sound in the house, wondering if reality itself had broken somehow. When she finally did fall asleep, exhausted, it was past midnight. And when her alarm woke her the next morning, she grabbed her phone immediately, her heart pounding. Wednesday, March 8th. The date had changed. Time had moved forward. The relief was so powerful she started crying, sitting in bed in the gray morning light, Hemingway looking at her with concerned golden eyes. Over the following weeks, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She'd lived the same day twice. Or had she? The more distant she got from the event, the more her rational mind tried to dismiss it. Maybe she'd been exhausted.
Maybe she'd experienced some kind of intense déjà vu that made her believe she'd lived the day before. But that didn't explain the specificity of her memories, Ginny's exact words, the exact sequence of events, the feeling that she was watching a movie she'd already seen. She began researching. Late at night, after schoolwork was done, she'd sit at her laptop and search, reliving the same day, time loop experiences, feeling like repeating a day. The internet offered her endless theories, everything from simulation theory to quantum physics, to mystical explanations about soul contracts and karmic cycles. None of it felt right. Most of it felt like people desperately trying to explain something inexplicable, creating elaborate frameworks to make sense of the nonsensical.
Then she found scientific literature on temporal perception and memory. She learned about how the human brain doesn't experience reality in real time. There's actually a lag of about 300 to 500 milliseconds between when something happens and when we consciously perceive it. Our brains are constantly predicting what's about to happen next, building a model of reality based on patterns from the past. This prediction happens so smoothly, so seamlessly, that we don't notice it. We think we're experiencing now, but we're actually experiencing our brain's best guess about what now should be, based on what just happened a fraction of a second ago. Margaret read about something called predictive coding, the brain's way of anticipating sensory input before it arrives. When you're walking downstairs, your brain predicts how each step will feel before your foot lands. When someone is speaking to you, your brain predicts what words might come next based on context. This prediction system is what allows us to function quickly and efficiently in a complex world. But sometimes this system creates strange experiences. Déjà vu, for instance, happens when the prediction system misfires. Your brain thinks it's predicted something it actually just experienced, creating the eerie feeling of having been in this exact moment before. Could something similar have happened to her? Could her brain have somehow created such a detailed prediction of March 7th that when she actually lived it, the day felt like a repeat? But that didn't fully explain the intensity of what she'd experienced. She'd had déjà vu before, everyone has, and it was nothing like this. This had been complete, total, undeniable. Every detail matched, every word, every gesture, every moment. She made an appointment with her doctor, Dr. Samuel Chen, whom she'd been seeing for years. In his office, surrounded by the smell of hand sanitizer and the soft hum of the air conditioning, she tried to explain what had happened. Dr. Chen listened carefully, taking notes, his face neutral and professional. He asked about her stress levels, her sleep patterns, whether she'd experienced any headaches or visual disturbances. Margaret answered honestly. Work was fine, sleep was generally good, no headaches, no visual problems. She felt perfectly healthy except for this one inexplicable experience. Dr. Chen suggested it might have been a sleep disorder called parasomnia, where the boundary between sleeping and waking gets blurred. Sometimes people in parasomnia states can have extremely vivid, coherent experiences that they later remember as real. He recommended she see a sleep specialist if it happened again, and perhaps consider stress reduction techniques. Margaret thanked him and left, but she knew deep in her gut that what she'd experienced wasn't a sleep disorder. She'd been awake. She'd lived through that day twice, somehow, in some way that defied normal explanation. Then she discovered something that changed her perspective entirely. She wasn't alone. On an obscure forum dedicated to unusual temporal experiences, she found dozens of accounts from people who'd experienced similar phenomena. A man in Toronto who'd lived the same Tuesday 3 times in a row. A woman in London who'd woken up to discover it was yesterday. A retired teacher in Tokyo who'd lived through his daughter's wedding twice. Their stories had the same quality as hers, specific, detailed, undeniable to the person experiencing it, but leaving no evidence behind. One person on the forum had linked to a research paper about temporal anomalies in memory formation during periods of high stress or emotional intensity. The paper theorized that in rare circumstances, the brain's prediction and memory encoding systems could become temporarily desynchronized, creating what felt like lived experience, but was actually an incredibly detailed predictive simulation. The brain was so good at predicting what would happen, based on years of pattern recognition, that the prediction felt indistinguishable from actual experience. And when the predicted events then occurred in reality, they felt like repetitions.
Margaret sat back in her chair, staring at her laptop screen as evening darkened outside her window. Was that what had happened? Had her brain predicted March 7th so accurately, down to Jenny's comment, Patricia's story, every small detail, that when she actually lived it, the day felt like a repeat? But why? What purpose would such an elaborate prediction serve? The research paper suggested it might be related to threat detection, the brain running simulations of the near future to identify potential dangers, to prepare responses, to increase survival chances.
In primitive times, this would have been useful, predicting where a predator might appear, anticipating how a hunt might unfold. But Margaret was a high school English teacher in Portland. There were no predators, no life-threatening situations. March 7th had been completely ordinary. So why would her brain have run such an elaborate simulation? Unless the purpose wasn't about specific threats, but about something else. About maintaining a sense of control and predictability in an uncertain world. About creating the comforting illusion that tomorrow could be known, could be prepared for, could be mastered. 3 months after the March 7th incident, Margaret had reached a kind of peace with what had happened. She'd continued reading research on temporal perception, on consciousness, on the neuroscience of prediction. She'd learned that our experience of reality is far stranger and more constructed than we typically realize. Every sight, sound, smell, and sensation is filtered through predictive models. Our brains are constantly asking, what should I expect next? And then comparing incoming sensory data to those expectations. When reality matches prediction, everything flows smoothly. When reality violates prediction, when something unexpected happens, we get a jolt of surprise, a prediction error signal that tells the brain to update its models. This is how we learn, how we adapt, how we make sense of patterns in the chaos of existence. But it also means we're never quite experiencing reality directly. We are experiencing our brain's interpretation of reality, its best guess about what's out there, colored by our past experiences, our expectations, our fears and hopes. In a very real sense, we all live slightly in the future, in the world our brain predicts will exist half a second from now. Margaret began to notice this prediction system at work in her daily life. She'd reach for her coffee cup and realize her hand had already started moving before she'd consciously decided to pick it up, her brain predicting the action. She listened to Patricia speak and realized she could often anticipate what Patricia would say next, not because of any psychic ability, but because she'd known Patricia for 15 years, and her brain had learned Patricia's speech patterns, her favorite phrases, her typical responses. This was what brains did. They predicted, they simulated, they tried to stay one step ahead of reality. The experience with March 2nd had been this system on overdrive. For some reason, stress perhaps, or just the random firing of neurons in just the right pattern, her brain had generated an incredibly detailed simulation of the coming day. So detailed that when she actually lived the actual day, the match between prediction and reality was nearly perfect enough to make her believe she'd already lived it. The small differences, a word here, a gesture there, she might have forgotten or misremembered in the shock of the experience. This understanding brought Margaret a strange sense of relief. She wasn't losing her mind. She hadn't broken through into a parallel universe. She hadn't been trapped in a time loop. She'd simply experienced her own brain's prediction machinery working so well that it fooled her consciousness into believing the prediction was memory. It was unsettling, yes, but it was also, in a way, beautiful, evidence of just how sophisticated and powerful the human brain is, how it's constantly working beneath conscious awareness to create the seamless experience we call reality. She started sharing her understanding with others, cautiously at first. When a colleague mentioned having intense déjà vu, Margaret shared some of what she learned. When her daughter called and mentioned a strange dream that felt too real, Margaret explained the science of temporal perception. She wasn't trying to convince people or recruit them to a particular view. She simply wanted to share the comfort of understanding that had helped her.
Think about your own experiences of déjà vu, that eerie feeling of having been in this exact moment before, seeing this exact scene, hearing these exact words. It's not a glitch in the matrix. It's not a sign you're repeating your life. It's your brain's prediction system briefly showing itself. The curtain pulled back just slightly on the machinery that usually works invisibly. Your brain predicted this moment so accurately that when it arrived, it felt familiar. Not because you've lived it before, but because you've already imagined it, a fraction of a second earlier. Or consider how you sometimes know what someone is about to say before they say it. Not because you are telepathic, but because your brain has learned the patterns of their speech, the rhythms of their thought, the context of the conversation. It's running ahead, predicting, preparing your responses. When they speak the words your brain anticipated, you feel a little jolt of recognition. You are right, but it wasn't prophecy. It was pattern recognition happening faster than conscious thought. Margaret realized that her March 7th experience, as frightening and disorienting as it had been, had given her a gift, awareness of how her own mind worked. She paid attention now to her thoughts, her expectations, her assumptions about what would happen next. She noticed when her predictions were accurate and when they were wrong. She became fascinated by the moments when reality surprised her, when something happened that her brain hadn't anticipated. Those moments felt more real, more vivid,
because they forced her brain to update its models, to pay fresh attention. She also developed a deep appreciation for the present moment, paradoxically because she understood how much of what we call the present is actually prediction and memory. True presence, true immersion in the now, requires quieting the prediction machinery, stopping the constant anticipation of what comes next. Meditation practitioners had known this for thousands of years. Neuroscience was just catching up, explaining in technical terms what contemplatives had experienced directly, that ordinary consciousness is a constructed thing, a simulation, and that beneath it lies something more immediate and less predictable. A year after the incident, Margaret found herself thinking about it less frequently. It had become part of her personal history, a strange experience that had taught her something valuable about the nature of consciousness and perception. She still taught English at the same high school, still had her morning routine with Earl Grey tea and Hemingway, still had lunch with Patricia, but something subtle had shifted in how she moved through her days. She noticed the small glitches now, the moments when her brain's predictions were slightly off, like when she'd reach for a glass of water and it felt heavier or lighter than expected, that tiny jolt of surprise telling her brain to update its model of the glass's weight. Or when she'd walk into a room expecting to find something in one place and discovering it was actually somewhere else, that brief disorientation before reality reasserted itself. These weren't grand temporal anomalies. They were just the ordinary friction between prediction and reality, happening countless times every day, usually beneath notice.
She found it oddly comforting, noticing these glitches. They reminded her that her experience of reality was mediated by her brain's constant work of prediction and interpretation. She wasn't a passive recipient of sensory data. She was an active participant in creating her conscious experience. When students would complain that a test had been unfair or that they just knew they'd done poorly before results were returned, Margaret would gently point out how much of their experience was prediction rather than fact. "Wait and see what actually happens," she'd tell them. "Your brain is trying to protect you by predicting the worst, but predictions aren't reality." Patricia noticed the change in her friend, though she couldn't quite identify what was different. Margaret seemed more present somehow, more attentive to the moment-to-moment flow of life. When Patricia spoke, Margaret really listened, rather than already formulating her response. When unexpected things happened, a fire drill, a schedule change, a student's emotional outburst, Margaret handled them with calm flexibility, rather than frustration at having her expectations disrupted. "You seem different lately," Patricia said one day at lunch, 6 months after the incident. "More zen or something." Margaret smiled. "I had a weird experience a while back that made me think differently about how we experience time," she said. She considered telling Patricia the whole story, but decided against it. How could she explain in a way that wouldn't sound insane? "I realized I was spending too much mental energy anticipating what would happen next, instead of paying attention to what was actually happening now." The truth was, Margaret had developed a kind of game with herself. She tried to notice her brain's predictions before they happened. When walking down a hallway, she'd pay attention to the moment her brain anticipated who might come around the corner. When grading papers, she'd notice herself predicting what error a particular student would make before seeing it. When cooking dinner, she'd observe her hands reaching for ingredients before her conscious mind had decided she needed them. It was like watching the machinery of consciousness at work, seeing the predictions that usually operated invisibly. Sometimes, when she felt stressed or overwhelmed, she'd close her eyes and practice being in the moment without prediction, just breathing, just sensing. No anticipation of the next breath, the next sound, the next thought. It was surprisingly difficult. Her brain wanted to predict, wanted to stay ahead of reality. But in those brief windows when she could quiet the prediction machinery, she felt something like peace, a stillness underneath the constant simulation of past and future. She never again experienced anything like the March 7th incident. No more full-day predictions that felt like repetition. Perhaps it had been a one-time perfect storm of neural activity, unlikely to recur. Or perhaps her awareness of the prediction system itself had changed how it functioned. She didn't know, and she found she didn't need to know. The experience had served its purpose. It had cracked open her understanding of consciousness and shown her the constructed nature of temporal experience. On the anniversary of March 7th, Margaret woke at 6:45, made her Earl Grey tea, and sat at her kitchen table watching the sunrise through the window. She thought about the version of herself who'd lived this day twice,
who'd been so frightened by the experience. She felt compassion for that earlier self, and gratitude. The fear had pushed her to understand something profound about the human brain's relationship to time. Your brain, she'd realized, is not trying to deceive you when it predicts the future. It's trying to protect you, to give you an advantage, to help you navigate a complex and sometimes dangerous world. The fact that it's so good at prediction that you sometimes mistake prediction for memory, that's not a bug, it's a feature. It means your brain has learned the patterns of your life so thoroughly that it can simulate tomorrow with stunning accuracy. And when tomorrow arrives and matches the simulation, you feel the deep satisfaction of a prediction confirmed, even if you don't consciously recognize it as prediction.
We are all living slightly in the future, Margaret thought, watching the morning light paint golden streaks across her kitchen wall. Our brains reach forward in time, pulling the future into the present, making the unknown feel knowable. And most of the time, this works beautifully. We navigate our days with grace, responding to situations that our conscious minds haven't fully registered yet, because our prediction systems have already prepared us. We are time travelers in our way, not into the past or the distant future, but into the next few seconds, the next few minutes, the anticipated next day. And sometimes, rarely, mysteriously, the machinery shows itself. The prediction feels like memory. The simulation feels like lived experience. The future feels like déjà vu. Margaret Henderson taught English for 5 more years before retiring, moving to a small house near the coast where she could hear waves from her bedroom window. She kept in touch with Patricia, visited her daughter regularly, and read extensively about neuroscience and consciousness studies. The March 7th experience remained with her always, not as trauma, but as insight, a moment when reality had lifted its veil and shown her the strangeness underneath the familiar. She'd learned that the human brain is humanity's most sophisticated prediction machine, constantly generating simulations of what comes next, and that our moment-to-moment experience of reality is really our brain's best guess about reality, updated constantly as new sensory information arrives. She'd learned that time itself, the steady forward flow we take for granted, is partly constructed by consciousness, our brains stitching together discrete moments into the seamless narrative we call life. She'd learned that the boundary between prediction and memory, between imagination and experience, is far more porous than we like to believe. Most importantly, she'd learned not to fear these insights. Yes, it could be unsettling to realize that you're living in a simulation, not a computer simulation, but a neural simulation, your brain's prediction of what reality should be. But it was also empowering. If you understood the prediction machinery, you could work with it rather than being unconsciously driven by it. You could notice when anxiety was making you predict catastrophe. You could catch yourself assuming tomorrow would be just like yesterday. You could create space for genuine surprise, for moments when reality exceeded prediction, for experiences that updated and expanded your internal models of the world. So, dear friends, I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever had a moment when time seemed to repeat? When you woke up certain you'd already lived the day ahead? When reality felt like déjà vu so intense you questioned your sanity? If so, know that you're not alone, and you're not crazy. You've simply experienced your brain's prediction system working overtime, showing you just how sophisticated and powerful this 3-pound organ in your skull really is. Your brain is trying to protect you, to prepare you, to give you an advantage in an unpredictable world. And sometimes, in doing so, it creates experiences that feel impossible, magical, or terrifying. Share your stories in the comments below. Tell us about your moments of temporal strangeness, your experiences of prediction and déjà vu, your times when the future felt familiar before it arrived. Your stories help all of us understand the mysteries of consciousness better. And please, hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who's ever questioned the nature of their reality. We're all in this strange, predicted, simulated experience of existence together. Understanding how it works doesn't make it less beautiful. If anything, it makes the beauty more profound. Thank you for listening, dear friends. Until next time, stay curious about your own mind. Stay present in this moment, this actual moment, not the predicted next one. And remember, your brain is your best protector, even when it makes you believe you've lived tomorrow yesterday. Take care.